Yeah. Yes.
Okay, good. Thanks. So what we're going to do is I'm going to set up, so we are going to talk about how factor prices are determined. So that's going to take us to the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. We have constant returns to scale. Okay. So remember, this is still, as I said, a neoclassical model. How do these constant returns to scale models work? So what we're going to do is we are going to consider a firm that is minimizing its costs. Right? So C of W comma R is the cost function of the firm. And so the firm is minimizing costs. This is an HO model. So you just have labor and capital now. So it's two factors of production, very different from the Ricardian model because we have this additional factor. Firms will minimize cost subject to the what we call the production function, right? So this is f of L comma k greater than or equal to y. Y is output here. Now, this is basically economics. Those of you who have, I think most of you have an econ background here, you know that this is just a standard cost minimization problem. So the firm is going to choose optimal labor and capital such that cost is minimized subject to that production function, right? The production or technology constraint. Now, because the production function is constant returns to scale, the solutions that you're going to get for the optimal labor and capital use, which is L star and K star, is simply going to be a proportion of output. Okay? So that's what we're going to denote here as L star. The optimal labor that the firm wants to use is going to be some proportion AL of total output Y. Similarly, optimal capital use is some proportion AK of output Y. So the good thing about this is if I want to set Y equals 1, which means I want to see what happens when I'm producing 1 unit of output, then all I can do is set Y equals 1, and that gives me L star is AL and K star is AK. In other words, AL and AK are called unit factor requirements. So what are unit factor requirements? They tell us how much labor, how much capital do I need optimally in order to produce 1 unit of output. Okay, that's why they're called unit factor requirements. Now, of course, you know that if you solve this cost minimization problem, AL and AK are actually functions of W and R, where W and R are the wage rate and the cost of capital, R. Okay? So when the firm solves the cost minimization problem, you can get the optimal unit factor requirements, AL and AK, as functions of W and R. So the good thing is because we are in constant returns to scale, once I know how much labor and how much capital I need to produce 1 unit of machinery, footwear, I can simply scale up when I want to produce, say, 10 machines and 10 footwear. All I need to do is multiply AL and AK by 10 times. Right? So that's the idea of constant returns to scale. If you want to scale up output, just scale up the inputs proportionately. And that proportion is AL and AK. So let's get back to our Heckscher-Ohlin model. So we have a situation where we have 2 goods and 2 factors, right? I is going to index the sector here because we also have the machinery and footwear sector. So firms in each sector are going to minimize cost subject to the production function, and then they are going to choose the optimal L and K. So that gives us our optimal unit factor requirements. So I'm going to call those AXL, AYL, AXK, and AYK. So just to recap the notation, AXL is the amount of labor that is used optimally in the production of 1 unit of X coming out of the firm's cost min problem. AYL is the amount of labor that is used optimally in the production of 1 unit of Y. Similarly for capital, AXK and AYK. Okay, so these I'm going to obtain from the cost minimization problem, and these will be functions of W and R. Now, once I know that each firm is going to be minimizing costs, right, I can put all of this together and look at the equilibrium conditions. So because we have perfect competition in all markets, we can look at the 0 profit conditions. Firms are making 0 profits in equilibrium. So what are the 0 profit conditions? Price per unit equals cost per unit. Price equals cost, constant returns to scale, and 0 profits. Right? Similarly, the Y sector. Price of Y has to be equal to the cost of producing Y. right? And both of these costs are going to be functions of W and R. So these two zero profit conditions are going to essentially give me the W and R for every fixed level of price. So for now, I'm going to assume that this is a small open economy. It cannot really dictate the price. So prices are fixed. And so as soon as I have Px and Py, I can solve this system of equations, which is two equations in two unknowns, W and R, and I can actually solve for W and R. Right? So the zero profit conditions give me WR. I sub in, I get the AXs, right? AXL, AYL, AXK, and AYK. And then I'm going to appeal to the second set of conditions called the full employment conditions. What are the full employment conditions? They are telling you that you have a certain amount of labor, you have a certain amount of capital as endowments, and you're going to use up all your labor and all your capital in the two sectors X and Y. So that is what this first equation says. The amount of labor I need to make 1 unit of X times how much X I make, plus the amount of labor I need in Y times the amount of Y I make is going to exhaust my labor endowment. And similarly for capital. Okay. Now, once I have these two sets of conditions, they are going to give me X and Y. So I'm going to be able to solve for X and Y from the second set of employment conditions. So here we are now getting to a new idea or a new tool really, which is called the learner diagram. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of those conditions I showed you on the previous slide, the zero profit conditions and the full employment conditions, and I'm going to put them on this learner diagram. So what do I do with the learner diagram? This should be familiar to you in a way, because this is very similar to a cost minimization problem when you do it graphically. So what is the graphical cost minimization problem? You typically have what you call as an isoquant, right? And once you have the isoquant for a particular industry, it gives you the different combinations of labor and capital you would need to produce a certain amount of output. That's what the isoquant gives you. Once you have the isoquant, the cost minimization problem is about going to lowest cost possible, and cost is given by what we call as an isocost line. So you want to take the isocost line to the minimum possible extent such that it is still tangent to the isoquant. And that gives you the optimal labor and capital use. So you must be familiar with this from your standard cost minimization. So this learner diagram is very similar. So we're going to plot labor on the x-axis and we're going to plot capital on the y-axis. The only difference, there are two differences here. First, we have two sectors in this country, right? India has two sectors, footwear and machinery. So we're going to put the isoquants for both footwear and machinery on the same diagram. So that's the difference. So we're going to have two sectors and two isoquants on this diagram. The second thing is everything here is going to be expressed in terms of $1 worth of output or cost. Right? So that is why we call this a unit value isoquant. And we're also going to get a unit cost line. So everything is unit because it's everything equals $1. Right? Now, can anyone tell me why these isoquants look different? Why did I put the X isoquant here and the Y sector isoquant up top there? Why did I do that? Why don't I put both of them in the same at the same place? Anyone? Yes. So this is because of the intensities, right, of the two sectors. So because X is labor intensive, the isoquant, if you notice, is way more towards the labor axis, right? But the Y isoquant machinery is towards the capital axis. So that's why we have these two different isoquants looking a little bit different. Now, once I put in the isoquants there, what is the equation of the isoquant? So this isoquant is basically how much Y I can produce. That is $1 worth of Y. That's why I'm dividing 1 over the price of Y here. So let's be careful. X, again, divided by the price of X, because this is $1 worth of X. And then the isoquant gives me the different combinations of capital and labor I need to produce $1 worth of both X and Y. Now, once I put in these two isoquants, I'm going to bring in the isocost line. What is the isocost line? The equation for that is just WL plus RK equals 1. In other words, the total cost of production equals $1. That's the isocost line. So the slope of that isocost line is simply negative W over R. So the isocost line is going to hit the x-axis at intercept 1 over W. It hits the y-axis at intercept 1 over R. Now, I need equilibrium in both sectors because firms in both sectors are going to be minimizing their costs, right? So what I need is this isocost line, or the unit isocost line, to be tangent to both of the isoquants simultaneously. Because note that the economy only has one W over R, right? The W over R is the same for shoes, the shoe sector, the footwear sector, and the machinery sector. So what I need for equilibrium is this line to be tangent to both isoquants at the same time. That happens at this particular equilibrium. And that will give me what we call the expansion paths of the X sector and the Y sector. So these lines that you see here, K over Lx and K over Ly, these are called expansion paths because they tell you what proportion of capital and labor these sectors use in equilibrium. Okay, so the X sector is going to use capital and labor in that ratio, and the Y sector uses this in the ratio K over Ly. Okay, so this is the equilibrium on what we call is a Lerner diagram. So what I am telling you from this diagram is if you give me Px and Py, I can draw these isoquants, right? Because once I know what Px is and Py is, I know what these isoquants look like. Once I draw these isoquants, there's only one way in which the W over R line can be tangent to both. So once I see what that W over R line is, then the slope is fixed, right? There's only one way I can draw that line, and that is going to fix the W over R. Excuse me. Sorry about that. I think I swallowed the wrong way. Can you hear me? Is that good? Sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So as I was saying, once we have the isoquants, we have the W over R. Okay. So this is about the determination of W over R from the zero profit conditions here, right? So this is what I showed you graphically. Now let's move on to the second part where we have these expansion paths, but then we're going to put in what we call is the endowment. So this K over L is going to be India's capital to labor endowment, right? When we say endowment, it's how much capital and how much labor India has. I also, to give you more jargon on this, those who know trade theory know what this is called. Does anyone know what these two lines together are called? So this is the expansion path for X, expansion path for Y. If I put those two together, what do I get? Does anyone know? No, it's not an offer curve. I see there's someone who said it's an offer curve. It's not an offer curve. It's called the cone of diversification. Okay, why is it the cone of diversification? Because if you look at this, it looks like a cone, right? It looks like a cone and spans the expansion paths for the two sectors. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at India's K over L endowment, and I'm going to plot that as a point on this Lerner diagram. Right? Now note that this endowment lies within the cone of diversification. So once I have the cone of diversification, K over L lies in the cone. Now the question is, how do I allocate labor and capital to the two sectors so that the entire endowment of labor and capital is used up? Okay, so that is the question. And to do that, what we're going to do is simply draw a parallelogram. So I'm going to join this point B to the point K over L, to the endowment point, and I'm going to join the endowment point to the point D. And I do that by drawing a line here parallel to the expansion path for X, and I draw a line there parallel to the expansion path for Y. Okay. Why am I doing this? The reason I'm doing this is now I know how to allocate labor and capital to the two sectors in the ratio of the expansion paths, because note that that's the optimal K over L ratio in each sector. The firms have done their cost minimization problem, and they have told me that they want to use labor and capital in these different ratios. So I'm going to keep those ratios as it is, and I'm going to see how can I allocate labor and capital so that I exhaust my endowment. And that's the way to do this. So I'm going to use OB is going to be the capital and labor for the Y sector, and then B to K over L is going to tell me how much labor and capital is going to go to the X sector. Okay, so if I take the point B, I look at where it hits the Y-axis, I look at where it hits the X-axis, and that tells me that that amount of labor and that amount of capital will go into Y, into machinery. And then everything else, right, goes into the X sector. So what have I done? I have found a way to allocate the total amount of labor and capital I have in such a way that all of it is exhausted, there's no unemployment, and B, both those sectors are using the capital and labor in the ratio that is optimal, that comes out of that cost minimization problem. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about factor price equalization, a very, very important point in trade theory. I think there was a question about this earlier. So what is the theorem on factor price equalization? It's a powerful result, right? Now, some of you might find it a bit unrealistic. We'll talk about that. But it says that if both countries are producing both goods and both countries face the same prices, and they're producing using the same technology, right? These are the assumptions, and that's what the HO assumptions are under free trade. Then as long as the endowments are in the cone of diversification, then the zero profit conditions will ensure factor price equalization. So what are they telling us? So this theorem is telling us, look, once you have your prices, if I give you a set of prices, PX and PY, then we know that all countries in the world under international trade, in a trading equilibrium, are going to be facing the same price PY and PX. What does that mean? That means that every country is going to have an identical looking isoquant for X and Y, because they all have the same technology, they all have the same prices. Now, what does that mean? Once I fix these unit value isoquants here, I have already told you that every country then is going to pretty much have the same W over the iso cost line hitting those two isoquants at the two equilibrium points. Because there's only one way that I can draw the W over R line such that it is tangent to both of these isoquants. So essentially, what have I told you? As long as, right, we need of course, one condition here is we need the endowment point to be within this cone of diversification. Otherwise, there is going to be no equilibrium. So as long as these endowment points are within that cone of diversification, all countries are going to have the exact same W over R, W and R, factor prices. In other words, commodity trade is a perfect substitute for trade and factors. So what this is saying is a powerful result, saying even though labor and capital cannot move across countries, because goods are moving across countries freely, it's almost as though labor and capital were moving across countries, because these goods embody some amount of labor and capital. These are the factors of production, right? So it's almost as though labor and capital are going across countries embodied within the goods. And because goods trade is free, it acts as a substitute for trade in the factors of production, and even the factor prices are going to equalize across all countries. So this says that if trade is free, if all countries are facing the same prices, if they're all in the same cone of diversification, then they will all have the same wage and R, cost of capital. That's factor price equalization, or FPE. So the next time I say FPE, you know what I mean. It means that factor prices equalize across markets, across countries. Now, there are going to be two exceptions to the FPE, right? The first is that countries must fall within this cone of diversification. If they drop outside the cone of diversification, like country number 2, so think about an extremely labor-intensive, abundant country like Indonesia or something, or even India. If it's very labor-abundant outside the cone of diversification, then this argument does not hold, because then the country is going to specialize in producing the labor-intensive product. Okay, there's no way I can draw a parallelogram so that I can use the two, so that I can produce both of these commodities using those optimal capital labor ratios. It's not possible. I can't draw a parallelogram if the endowment is outside the cone, right? So then you're going to get specialization, and FPE will not hold. It will fail. The second exception to FPE, yes, then complete specialization occurs. The second exception is what we call as factor intensity reversal. So look at these two isoquants, right? X and Y. They look a little bit weird if you notice. Why do they look weird? They look weird because they're intersecting at 2 points. Okay. What does that mean? Now, what this means is that if you have a particular wage rental ratio, so suppose you take a country like India that has a lower wage to rental ratio. Wages are relatively low relative to the cost of capital in India. In the United States, let's take a case where the wage rental ratio is very high. It has a high W over R. Then what these isoquants are telling us is that in India, good X is going to be the more capital intensive good, and good Y is going to be the more labor intensive good. However, this is going to flip when you go to the United States. So in the United States, good X is going to be more labor intensive, and good Y is going to be more capital intensive. So the goods basically flip in intensity, right? When the W over R changes. Now, if you think of an example of this, you can give many examples, but one example I like to give is the production of corn. So corn production in a country like India is quite labor intensive, because agriculture is still labor intensive in India because of the technology, right? So if you compare, say, corn with, say, electronics, then you're going to find that in India, corn is way more labor intensive than electronics. Whereas when you go to the US, I don't know if you're familiar with it, but corn production, if you go to US farms ever, you will see, is extremely capital intensive. They mostly just use robots. They have maybe one person to man the robot, but essentially you're not going to see any people on a cornfield in the US, right? So in the US, you're going to see corn to be more capital intensive than electronics. Right? So that's what we mean by factor intensity reversal, this kind of switching. If that happens, then again, you're not going to get FPE, factor price equalization. Okay. All right, so I think we're coming up to a break. So I'm going to see if I can finish Stolper, Samuelson, and motivate Ripchinsky before we break. Okay.
So I think before we just go there, there's one question about the angle of the cone of diversification. If that increases, what does that mean?
The angle of the cone. Oh, I see. So how sharp it is. Well, yeah, that can happen. So if these sectors diverge massively between each other, right? If they're very, very different in terms of their capital intensities, then you're going to see that the angle of the cone is much wider. If they're more similar, you're going to see that it's sharper or more condensed. And that can have implications, because note that the smaller the angle of the cone, the fewer the countries might be within the cone of diversification. So if the cone is too narrow, not many countries will fall within the cone. Some of them are going to start falling outside of the cone. Right, and then that's going to have implications for FPE, right? Factor price equalization. Any other questions, Gautam, that I should take at this point on the diagram itself?
I don't think so. I think we can proceed.
Okay. So what is the Stolper-Samuelson theorem? It says that an increase in the relative price of a good will increase the real return to the factor used intensively in that good, and it reduces the real return to the other factor. Now, this is actually quite a mouthful, so I'll try to put it in terms of the example that we have, because that's actually much easier. And so let us take our two sectors, footwear and machinery. Now, machinery is going to be Y, and suppose that it is a skill-intensive sector, meaning it uses a lot of skilled labor. Okay? X is unskilled labor intensive, which is something like footwear. Okay, so I'm going to draw this learner diagram. I have unskilled labor on the x-axis and I have skilled labor on the y-axis. I have my usual cone of diversification. I have my isoquants and the unit cost line intersecting both isoquants. Okay? So suppose that there is an increase in the relative price of a good, or in other words, here we have let px fall. So in this case, the price of textiles, or no, it's not textiles here, it's footwear. The price of footwear falls. Okay? So let's talk about that. What happens? Now, if the price of X falls, remember that price of X is hiding in the denominator here, right? Because this is a unit value isoquant. So I've divided by the price of X. If the price of X falls, then that isoquant is going to shift out. Now, can we think about what happens when the isoquant shifts out? What changes here? Are we in equilibrium? Yes, we are not in equilibrium. So the isocost line has to change. So it's going to rotate so that it is now tangent to both of the isoquants. And so we have to take into account the fact that we have a new isoquant here, which is the blue line. So now we have a new isocost curve that is tangent to the new isoquant and the old one for the y-sector, right? So that's fine. But now let's talk about what happens, who gains and who loses. So if you remember, I said the intercept here is going to be 1 over the W of unskilled labor. There, the intercept is going to be 1 over W skilled labor, right? So if the line has rotated so that it is hitting at point D star, it's hitting the x-axis at D star. What does that mean? That means essentially your W of unskilled labor has gone down because this is now the new 1 over WUS. Right? So what have we established here simply by looking at the rotation of the isocost line and looking at the intercepts? We have shown that W unskilled has fallen and W skilled has gone up. In other words, WUS over WS, the relative wage of unskilled labor, has gone down. Okay, and that comes out of this learner diagram. So that's what the Stolper-Samuelson theorem tells us. If there's going to be a decrease in the price of a particular product, then what happens to the returns to both factors? Well, the factor that is used intensively in that product is going to lose, its age goes down, and the other factor is going to gain. Okay? And that is the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. Okay? So what we show here is that essentially, right? So here's the change. Okay, so D goes to D star, the unskilled wage falls, the skilled wage rises, and production becomes less skill intensive in both sectors. So you can see how the expansion path has rotated as well. So both sectors are now using more unskilled labor relative to skilled labor, and that's not surprising because unskilled labor is cheaper now. Okay. So before I break, what I want to do is ask you this question. What implication does this have for inequality? And let's talk about inequality as the differential between skilled and unskilled workers, right? So when you have a skill premium, that's an increase in inequality. When unskilled workers lose at the cost of skilled workers, that's going to be more inequality. So let's talk about it that way. So what are the implications of free trade to inequality, right? So if you let's talk about India and the US. So we have India and the US. India has a comparative advantage in, say, footwear. The US has a comparative advantage in machinery. Now, when I open up to international trade, what is going to happen to the prices in India? So what we know is because India has a comparative advantage in footwear, when I open up to trade, the price of footwear is going to go up, right? So if the price of footwear goes up, then who is going to gain from the Stolper-Samuelson theorem and who is going to lose? So we already have the answer to that question. We know that Stolper-Samuelson tells us if the price of footwear goes up, then the factor that is used intensively in the production of footwear is going to gain in real terms relative to the other factors. So in this case, with international trade, unskilled labor in India, which is used intensively in footwear, is going to gain at the cost of skilled labor. In other words, inequality should come down in India with international trade. Now, note that the opposite is going to happen in the US. So in the US, you're going to have to see an increase in inequality, because when the US opens up to trade, then the price of machinery is going to go up relative to the price of textiles, because that's where the US has a competitive advantage. And then that means that, of course, the skilled labor is going to gain relative to unskilled labor, right? So Stolper-Samuelson effects, classic. And so the next thing we are going to see is, are these impacts borne out in the data? So I'm going to discuss when we come back some of the implications in what we see. Does this correspond to real life? And what we will talk about is Stolper-Samuelson seems to hold beautifully for developed countries, but it fails miserably in developing countries. So what we're finding is that with trade liberalization, inequality is going up everywhere, developed countries and developing countries. We would expect that for developed countries from Stolper-Samuelson, but it's really puzzling for developing countries. So we're going to talk about that a little bit when we come back. Okay, so, before I let you go, maybe this is a good time to run the poll. So what I'm going to do is run the poll here very quick. So I want you to answer this question. What estimation exercise do you want in lecture 3? Do you want a gravity model estimation? This is going to use cross-country data, or do you want a productivity and markup estimation that uses firm-level data? So the gravity model is useful for people who want to conduct policy exercises. If you're interested in questions like how do tariff barriers impact trade flows, then you would be working with a gravity model. If you're more interested in things like how does trade improve firm productivity and so on, then you're going to use you will be interested in the productivity and markup estimation. So I'm going to open up the poll. You will have exactly 2 minutes. So please have your hand right at that button. I'm going to open the poll and then 2 minutes, and please answer the question. Okay, so here we go. I am going to open up the poll now. So please give me your answer. Okay, so here you go. You have 2 minutes.
Right. So the poll should appear on the right side. It should be under the tab called polling. So in the comments, there are some, I think, people who think it might be good if you can cover both very quickly.
Oh, that's
what do you
going to be
think?
tough. That will be tough.
Okay, then let's stick to only one among the two, and whatever you vote for, the majority, that will be taken. Okay.
Oh, so 15 people haven't voted? I guess they're indifferent. I forgot to give the indifferent option.
Yeah, we can treat those as indifferent.
Yeah. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I think we have our results here. So it looks like it's the gravity model that people want. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. So I guess, Gautam, are we going to break for a few minutes, like 10 or 15 minutes, right?
15 is good.
Minutes. Okay, 15 is good. So we'll be back at
3:40.
3:40. Okay.
Okay.
All right.
And so just don't end the session or anything. Just keep as.
Oh, no, I won't end it. Yeah, I'll just go mute, and then when I come back, I'll unmute. Okay, thanks, everyone.
Hello? Asha, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Sorry. I think people maybe want a quick recap of the inequality implications from Stokes-Samuelson.
Okay.
And I just wanted to know how far was the gap between the two options in the vote, because there was somebody who says that due to connectivity they missed it and they vote for productivity. But if it's not off by a lot, then I don't think the vote will count.
Okay, so let me see. So here we have, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so it was, gravity was 28 and productivity was 23.
I see. Then, yeah, I think even if you add that vote, it doesn't vote.
Yeah. Look, I can see, I see what people are saying. I mean, it is a close, in a sense, it is a close, yeah, but I can see if I have time tomorrow to do both. I could try. Maybe I can cut down a little bit on detail and give a quicker overview of both. Do you think that would be better, or?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So what I'll do then is I will not go into the usual level of detail that I go into these estimations, and I will try and give a quick overview of both of them. Yeah, okay.
Sounds good.
I mean, it will be tricky, but I guess I could spill over a little bit into the fourth lecture as well.
Okay. You mean if you cover both, then some of that could spill into the day after tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean, not a lot. We'll see how. I think I will get a better sense tomorrow when I finish.
Yeah.
Look,
That'll be
I'll
good.
do my best. I'll do my best to finish it up tomorrow.
Okay. Yeah, I think we can start again. Just that this inequality implication, I think somebody was pointing that
Yes.
very quickly,
Yeah.
maybe.
Okay, so let me just recap what we talked about. So is everyone happy with were there any questions on the learner diagram itself, like the mechanics of that or anything? Was that clear?
There is no question here on that.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about inequality in developed and developed countries, right? So what is the Stolper? Let me go back to the statement of the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. So what the Stolper-Samuelson theorem tells us, and we have shown this on the learner diagram, right? That when there's an increase in the relative price of a good, then who gains? It's basically the factor that is used intensively in that good, right? That factor gains in real terms, and the other factor is going to lose in real terms. That's what we showed on the diagram. Okay? Now, let's talk about developed and developing countries. Typically, we think of developed countries as being abundant in capital relative to labor, and also skilled labor relative to unskilled labor, right? And we think of developing countries as being the opposite. They are more abundant in unskilled labor relative to skilled labor. So what the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem tells us then is that developing countries will specialize in the production of unskilled labor intensive products like textiles, footwear, electronic parts, and so on. And advanced countries are going to specialize in the production of skilled labor intensive products and things like aircraft, pharmaceuticals, right? Computers, and so on. So when these two countries open up to trade with each other, what do we think is going to happen? Well, firstly, because countries like India would have a comparative advantage in unskilled labor intensive products, they are going to specialize and export those products. And we know that then the price for those products is going to go up in these developing countries. relative to skilled labor intensive products. In advanced countries, you're going to see that prices of textiles, footwear, those are going to come down with international trade, and the prices of computers, aircraft is going to go up. Okay, so that's what is going to happen when these countries trade. Now, what the Stolper-Samuelson theorem then tells us is because in countries like India, the prices of footwear and textiles is going to go up, right? Because that's their comparative advantage and they start exporting it, those prices go up. The factors that are used intensively in those types of goods, which is unskilled labor, is going to benefit, and the other factor, which is skilled labor, is going to lose. Now, if we think about inequality as the difference between the wage of skilled labor and unskilled labor, in other words, the skill premium, then what the Stolper-Samuelson theorem tells us is in that developing countries, inequality must go down because unskilled labor is going to gain from trade, but skilled labor is going to lose, right? So that's a decrease in inequality. Now, what happens, I don't have my video. So what happens in, say, countries like the US is the opposite is going to happen. Because the US specializes in aircraft and computers, those prices are going to go up with international trade. And so skilled labor is going to gain at the cost of unskilled labor. So the wage to unskilled labor is going to go down. The skilled wage is going to go up. That's an increase in the skill premium. In other words, inequality is going to go up with international trade. That is the implication that comes out of the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. Okay. Is that clear? Any questions on that, on inequality and Stolper-Samuelson, trade and inequality? Okay, looks like there are no questions. Okay, what about the evidence? So can I then move on to, I'm going to talk about the evidence a little bit. So what does the empirical evidence show? So interestingly, what the empirical evidence has shown is that the skill premium is going to rise in a lot of developed countries, right? And that's very consistent with Stolper-Samuelson, as we just discussed. But in developing countries, the skill premium has also been rising, which is that basically it's against what Stolper-Samuelson would say. It's not consistent with the Stolper-Samuelson theorem. Okay. Now, one question that I want to point out for those of you who are interested in empirical work is that there is another culprit that also it kind of mimics international trade, and that is automation. Okay? Automation and artificial intelligence. And the reason I say that is with automation and artificial intelligence, you get the same kinds of effect because artificial intelligence and automation, robots, are typically complementary to skilled labor, and they are actually substitutes for unskilled labor. So what happens in developed countries is that, yes, with international trade, you see rising inequality, right? Because skilled labor gains in real terms, unskilled labor loses, but it's very hard to empirically pin down whether this is because of international trade or whether this is simply because of automation and AI. Because with automation and AI, you're going to see the exact same effects because robots complement skilled labor, the skilled wage is going to go up in the unskilled relative to the unskilled wage, right? So that's also an increase in inequality. So empirically, the literature has struggled a lot to disentangle the impact of trade liberalization in advanced countries relative to your to just AI and automation. Okay, so here's the wage inequality in the US. You can see how bad this is, right? So as you track the US economy, as it trades more and more with countries like China, Philippines, India, and so on, what you see is that the wage, the hourly wage by education levels is diverging massively. And this is pretty bad because not only is it that people with advanced degrees and with college are earning a higher and higher wage, it's also that those with less than high school education are actually earning a lower and lower wage. So the gap is because skilled wage is rising and the unskilled wage is actually falling. Okay, so that's a pretty sharp increase in inequality. Now, no wonder that countries like the US are seeing a backlash against globalization. In fact, the election of the Trump administration partly was driven by these types of issues, right? By a backlash to globalization, because a lot of the textile industries, the manufacturing industries were in the US were just simply shutting down because they could not compete with China, right? Which is a large economy that is abundant in unskilled labor. And so what the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem tells us is that once the US opens up to trade with China, it's going to start importing unskilled labor intensive goods from China, because that's where China has a comparative advantage. And that is going to decimate manufacturing, and it did. So I want to point you to this work by Otter, Dorn, and Hansen, and the China shock. I don't know how many of you are familiar. If you're interested in international trade, I urge you to look at Otter, either David Otter or Hansen, any of their websites, and they will have a link to a web page that focuses on the China shock. By the China shock, what they mean is this increase in Chinese import competition that the US saw after China's accession to the WTO. So China acceded to the WTO in 2002, and after that, it just massively increased exports to pretty much every other country in the world. And we're still reeling from the impact of that, of China's WTO accession, right? So Otter, Dorn, and Hansen have a series of papers where they're looking at the impact of Chinese competition on the US economy. And in the past few years, there's also been an emerging literature for India. So looking at the impact of Chinese competition using their strategy, their empirical strategy, and to see what happened to Indian industry, Indian labor market outcomes, and so on. Now, their identification strategy, their empirical strategy is actually pretty cool, because what they do is they're focusing on local labor markets, right? So they're looking at each county in the US, or a commuting zone as they call it, and they look at the industrial composition of that commuting zone. So if you have a commuting zone that basically had most of its industry in sectors like textiles and footwear and toys, those regions were hit a lot more by China's accession to the WTO, because those were the industries that were really hit most by Chinese imports, right? That is classic Heckscher-Ohlin. So they look at these different regions in the US, and they look at which regions were hit more by Chinese imports relative to other regions. And then they look at what happened to manufacturing in those regions. And they find that manufacturing employment fell dramatically. That's why they call it the China shock, right? And now there's been this plethora of studies using the China shock. So people are looking at all kinds of outcomes, like changes in marriage rates, divorce rates, fertility rates, crime, investments in public infrastructure, all of this coming from the impact of import competition from China. There's also a huge backlash to that literature, right? And so if you're interested, you can let me know and I can give you some reading. But a good place to start would be Otter, Dorn, and Hansen's webpage, okay, on the China shock. Okay, so what is happening in developing countries? Now, in developing, this is developed. So in developing countries, what we find is that inequality is rising with trade liberalization. So this is what we call a puzzle. And a lot of the trade literature has really worried about why the results in developing countries are completely against Stolper-Samuelson. So they're not in line with the Stolper-Samuelson impacts. Now, I don't have the time here to go into a lot of the explanations that people have come up with, but I'm going to give you the stories. Okay? So I can't go into the models, but I will tell you the stories for the different explanations. So one explanation has been Erik Verhoeven's work that focuses on exports and quality upgrading. A lot of this work is actually empirical. So those of you who are interested in taking the theory to do more empirical work, you would be interested in Erik Verhoeven's work. And what he argues is, look, when countries start exporting, so you're saying that, you know, the whole Stolper-Samuelson idea is India opens up to trade, it exports a whole lot of textiles, which is unskilled labor intensive, and hence unskilled labor has to benefit and inequality has to go down, right? But what Erik says is when countries start exporting, they have to actually change the types of products that they're exporting. So if you look at a textile firm that's serving the Indian market, it is actually producing and selling completely different products relative to an exporting firm that is exporting those same products to the US, for example, because exporters are going to have a totally different quality of products that they have to produce, which means that to produce better quality, they have to upgrade their technology. When they upgrade their technology, what type of labor are they really using? They're not using unskilled labor. Because they're using superior technology, they actually end up using more skilled labor. And so that can actually increase inequality even in developing countries. So Eric's idea is that it's all about quality upgrading and technology, even within sectors like textiles and footwear. So that's one explanation, is within sector heterogeneity. And we're going to talk a lot more about within sector heterogeneity when we tackle the Mellott's model that's coming up. Now, the other explanation is actually very interesting. I like this one a lot. It's by Feenstra and Hansen in the 90s. It's actually an old model, but it's still very interesting because it looks at outsourcing as an explanation for rising inequality. And the idea is as follows, right? So suppose you think about the US outsourcing to India, right? If the US is outsourcing to India, let's take a sector like IT, because we know that's where a lot of the outsourcing to India is taking place. So what Feenstra and Hansen say is you can rank tasks in IT on a spectrum. Okay, so we don't think about IT as a product, but we think about it as a series of tasks that are involved in the production of an IT product. So you could think of things like first software design, implementation, quality control, writing of the actual code, and then troubleshooting, for example. So these are different tasks. You can put these tasks on a spectrum. Okay? You can go from the most skilled labor intensive tasks to the most unskilled labor intensive tasks. Now, if you think about it, what type of tasks is the US outsourcing to India in IT? And the obvious answer to that is the US is actually outsourcing more unskilled labor intensive tasks within IT to India. So a lot of the software design is probably still being done in the US. But what is being outsourced to India is the slightly more unskilled labor intensive tasks, things like writing up the actual code, or even maybe the troubleshooting support and so on, right? Now, why is that important? That's important because when the outsourcing goes up in the United States, the US is going to start exporting or outsourcing more and more of these tasks like that are right in the middle, right? So think of something like writing code. So writing code for the US is actually an unskilled labor intensive task. But for India, writing code is actually a skilled labor intensive task. Okay, because that's the way these tasks are structured. So what Feenstra and Hansen argue is when outsourcing goes up, the US ends up outsourcing coding. And because for the US, that is actually unskilled labor intensive, the demand for unskilled labor in the US goes down and the skill premium in the US will go up. Whereas for India, the opposite is going to happen, right? Because coding is actually skilled labor intensive for India. So again, you're going to see an increase in the skilled demand for skilled labor relative to unskilled labor. And so that's going to give rise to increase the skill premium in India as well. So in both countries, because of outsourcing, you're going to see an increase in the skill premium. So that is the Feenstra and Hansen outsourcing model. Again, as I can't get into the details of the model, but you're welcome to literally Google Feenstra and Hansen outsourcing, and that will take you to the actual model. Okay? So these are the two key potential explanations in the literature for this. Okay, so that brings me to the last part of Heckscher-Ohlin, which is the Ripchinsky Theorem. Now, what is the Ripchinsky Theorem? It's going to tell us how things change when there's a change in factor endowments. In other words, what if you suddenly end up getting a lot more FDI? Or what if immigration suddenly goes up in India? How does that change the economy, right? How does that change wages? How does that change the returns to skilled and unskilled labor? And so on. So I want to motivate this by looking at the Brexit vote. Okay, so you're all familiar with what happened with Brexit, right? It was pretty shocking for everybody when Britain voted to leave the European Union. And a lot of the sort of discourse in the media was that this was all driven by immigration. So essentially what people were saying is the Brexit vote is actually a backlash to immigration. And if you look at the sort of polls that were coming out of the UK at that time, for example, this independent poll here looks at the percentage of people who say that they dislike these particular words and who actually voted Brexit. And you will see that it's almost 80%, right? So there's a very high correlation between those who said that they don't like immigration and actually voted Brexit. So there's a lot of, this is just one section of the evidence, but there were a lot of these polls that indicated that it was about immigration. So here's another one from The Economist. So if you look at different counties in the United Kingdom and look at who voted to remain in the EU and who voted to leave, and you look at the foreign-born population in these counties as of 2014, at first glance, it seems as though those counties that voted to remain in the European Union also had high immigrant population. So places like London, for example, very high immigrant population, but voted to remain. Then you might conclude that actually immigration wasn't driving the vote, because then you would see counties like London actually voting to leave, right? But that didn't happen. But then The Economist actually pointed out an interesting idea. What they said was, let's look at the change in the foreign-born population between 2001 and 2014. Okay? When you look at the change and plot who voted to remain and leave, what you find is there's actually quite a significant correlation. So it turns out that those counties, so for example, Boston is one county in the UK that had a major change, a major increase in the number of foreign-born individuals. Those are the counties that actually voted to leave, right? So rising immigration was correlated with a particular region voting to leave the European Union. Okay? So what I'm trying to point out here is immigration also generates a lot of sentiment against globalization, against integration. Okay? Why is that? Why are we worried about immigration? Okay? What is the general consensus about immigration? So if you open up, if India gets a whole lot of immigrants, right, say from Bangladesh, why is it that Indians are worried about that? What's the biggest concern here? Can anyone tell me why, if you walk down the street and ask a layperson, should we open up the border between India and Bangladesh and let Bangladeshi immigrants into the country? What do you think the answer is going to be? Is it going to be great? Let's do it. Okay, very good. So
people are worried about unemployment, wages, quality of immigrants, and yeah.
Very good. Yeah. So the main thing is going to be about loss of jobs. It's going to be about the fact that wages are going to go down. They're going to drive down your wage, right? So it's that's really the cultural aspects are there, but those we're not going to talk about that here. The economic aspects are mainly around losing your jobs and taking a hit on the wages. So let's talk about what the Heckscher-Ohlin model has to say. And here you will see the power of the theory, because what you're going to get is quite a counterintuitive result. Okay, so let's talk about what happens. What does the Heckscher-Ohlin model tell us will happen to wages in India when immigrants from Bangladesh cross the border? So what are we interested in? We're interested in asking the question, if India experiences an influx of immigrants, which means your labor endowment is going to go up, how is that going to affect the wage, and how is that going to affect, say, the return to capital? Okay, so can anyone tell me, here we have our usual learner diagram. We have the cone of diversification. Let's keep X as the labor-intensive good, so something like footwear. And here we have the capital-intensive good. Okay, so let's say that that is machinery. Here's our cone of diversification. Z is India's endowment point. In other words, it tells us how much capital and labor India has. Now, we have immigration. What's going to change on this graph, right? So what we are going to see is suddenly you have a whole bunch of labor. So your endowment point is going to shift to Z star. More labor, same amount of capital. Now, my question to you is, as long as Z star is still within the same cone of diversification, can you tell me what happens to W and what happens to R, the cost of capital? Can you argue through this? Okay, so someone says W rises. So what happens to the wage and the rental rate? Okay, so I think, Gautam, do you have any? I can see things like wages. Oh,
Right.
yes.
I don't have any personal responses.
Okay, all right. So what we see, some people are saying it remains the same, some say it goes up. The correct answer to this is that it remains the same. Okay? There is absolutely no change to W and R. Why? Because we're still in the cone of diversification, right? And what actually determines the W and R, if you remember, that is just the iso cost line that is tangent to both isoquants. So as long as the prices are not changing, as long as technology is not changing, my isoquants are still where they are. The expansion paths are still where they are, which means that the W over R line, which is tangent to both isoquants, is still not moving. It is exactly where it is. So nothing has changed for W and R. W and R do not change. And that is exactly the Ripchinsky theorem, right? So what it says is, look, if Z goes to Z star, you have immigration, W and R don't change at all. What changes is that, of course, your allocation of capital and labor to the two industries is going to change. Okay? So all that changes is how much labor and capital goes into machinery, how much labor and capital goes into footwear. Now, here is the interesting part. Look at the parallelogram. So earlier, we had OA going to the machinery sector, and then AZ tracking how much L and K went to the footwear sector, right? Now that has changed. You have OB going into the machinery sector, and B to Z star going into the footwear sector. In other words, what has happened here? What has happened is, as you can see from these arrows, right, the economy has shifted from making machinery towards making more footwear. In other words, with immigration, the sector that actually uses labor more intensively has expanded at the cost of the other sector. So it has borrowed capital and labor from this other sector, and it has actually expanded its output. So that's the way the economy adjusts to immigration. Okay, so let's look at the Ripchinsky theorem here. At constant commodity prices, an increase in the supply of a factor is going to lead to an increase in the output of the commodity that uses that factor intensively, and a reduction in the output of the other commodity. So this is a very powerful result. If you have immigration into India from Bangladesh, what this model tells us is India is going to now start making a lot more unskilled labor intensive products. So it will start making a lot more apparel, and that way it will absorb all of these excess immigrants without having an impact on the wage. There's another nuance to this. Not only is the apparel sector in India going to expand because it's absorbing these immigrants, it's also going to lead to a shrinking of all the other sectors. So as an example, the computer sector will actually shrink and the apparel sector will expand when you get more immigrants. And why is the computer sector shrinking? That's a little counterintuitive, right? Because you might ask, well, we have more immigrants, right? Why should one sector shrink to absorb these immigrants? And the answer to that is, note that capital hasn't really increased. Okay, so you're still operating with a fixed amount of capital, you just have more labor. So when the textile sector is expanding, it still has to take in some amount of extra capital, and it is going to do that from the other sector, which is the computer sector. So it's going to take some capital from there, and as a result, the computer sector is going to shrink. So that is the idea of the Ripchinsky theorem, right? So factor payments are not going to change, prices are not going to change. Okay. Now, there is an idea called Jones magnification effect. Again, since I don't have time, I can't go into it in great detail, but what this magnification effect tells you is the proportionate increase in textiles is going to be way more than the increase in immigration. So immigration comes in, you have a percentage increase in labor, but the increase in output is going to be much higher than that percentage increase in labor. So that's called a magnification effect in the Ripchinsky context. Okay. So here's the Ripchinsky theorem on the PPF. right? So here you have the initial PPF for India. So textiles on the x-axis, machinery on the y-axis. What happens with immigration? The PPF shifts out. Note that it's going to shift out on both axes, x and y, because you can make more machinery with more labor. You can also make more textiles with more labor, but you can make a lot more textiles with excess immigration than machinery. So what happens to the price ratio? It still stays the same. We're in a trading equilibrium. Prices don't change. And so the equilibrium goes from point B, the production equilibrium goes from point B to point B prime. In other words, the economy has moved towards more specialization in the good that uses labor more intensively. Okay? And there's a shrinking in the other sector. That's the Ripchinsky theorem on the PPF. So this is quite a powerful result, right? Because what this is saying, if you ask a layperson on the street, they will say, oh, a lot of labor comes in from Bangladesh that I'm going to lose because my wages are going to go down. What Heckscher-Ohlin says is, no, that's not going to happen, because all that's going to happen is that all of these people will be absorbed in the apparel sector. Other sectors may shrink, right? But the apparel sector is going to expand and absorb without having an impact on the wage. Now, I understand that this may happen in reality, and one of the reasons for that is there are a lot of rigidities in adjustment, right? So if I cannot just as a textile person seamlessly increase my capacity of production and simply absorb these workers. It's not easy to simply drop capital from other sectors. So there's rigidity in factor markets, right? And because there's rigidity, you may get an adjustment period. But overall, in the medium term, if all the factor markets are functioning perfectly, flexibly, then you should see this kind of absorption. So immigration should not have an impact on wages. So very important for policy. So I want to talk about the Miami boat lift. You may not know what the Miami boat lift is, but there's a lot of equivalence in other countries as well. So what happened was, because there was revolution in Cuba, a whole bunch of refugees from Cuba ended up in Miami on a boat. Okay. Now, Miami is a city in the US, so it's a small economy. And so when you had this big influx, and this is mostly men and mostly unskilled labor, right? So suddenly Miami had this influx of young men who were mostly unskilled. And so that was a kind of what we call as an immigration shock. Right? Now, if you ask the normal person on the street, they would say, oh, if a whole bunch of unskilled people end up in your local economy, that is going to tank the unskilled wage. But we know that that's not true according to the Hex Rolling Model, at least in the medium run, right? And so what does the evidence say? So here is the evidence. Let's look at what happened to apparel, which is unskilled labor intensive, in Miami. And let's compare what happened in Miami to other similar countries in cities in the US. Okay. So if you look at the comparison cities and Miami, here's when the boat lift happened, which is the green line. What you will see is that the Miami trend for apparel, now apparel production is generally decreasing over this time period, but that's fine. But if you look at it relative to comparison cities, Miami's apparel trend is not as downward sloping as for other cities. So comparatively, Miami is actually doing much better. It's producing way more apparel than comparison counties or cities. Okay? So that's consistent with Ripchinsky, because Ripchinsky will say, if there's a whole bunch of unskilled people that end up in Miami, then sectors that use unskilled labor intensively should expand at the cost of other sectors. So here you have evidence of expansion of apparel, right? What about other sectors? High-skilled industries. Let's look at the Miami trend, right, which is this yellow line, and let's look at the comparison trend. So the comparison trend isn't doing much, but Miami's production of high-skilled products is actually tanking right after the Mariel boat lift. So here's evidence of the Ripchinsky effect, right? What is happening here is that the Miami economy is absorbing all of these unskilled immigrants by expanding production relatively of apparel, and by contracting production of high-skilled industries. Okay. There's a lot more evidence that's more recent now by Giovanni Perry and George Borjas. Those of you who are interested in immigration, look up Giovanni Perry and George Borjas. They have a war of words going on, an intense debate. George Borjas is arguing immigration is bad for native workers. Giovanni Perry is arguing that immigration is actually good for native workers. Why? Giovanni's point is that immigrants and natives are not really truly substitutes, because immigrants end up complementing highly educated native workers, right? So immigrants do perform jobs that are very, very different from native jobs. So immigrants perform a lot more of the manual labor-intensive tasks in the US. Native workers, which is native-born workers, do a lot more of the language-intensive and communication-intensive tasks. They end up complementing each other, and you see positive wage effects for both types of workers because they end up complementing and not substituting each other. So there's a very big literature on this, but I urge you to look at George Borjas and Giovanni Perry if you're interested in immigration issues. Okay, any questions?
I think there are two important questions. One is this, the assumption or the result that economy absorbs all the excess resources. Is all behind that there is an assumption of full employment. So I guess the question is, I think this question was asked earlier also. If you allow for unemployment, do the results from Stoper-Samuelson or Ripchinsky change? So that's one thing. And the other is related to FDI coming into India. Does that lead to increase in capital intensive sectors at the cost of labor intensive sectors?
Yes. So the answer to the second, let me take the second one first. So the answer to the second question is theoretically that is what you would expect. If you ask me about actual studies that have shown that, I can't recall any empirical studies off the top of my head looking at FDI in India and how and what impacts it has on the rental rate of capital, partly because the returns to capital are pretty hard to measure. It's much easier to measure what's going on with wages rather than looking at returns to capital, right? So I haven't seen any studies, but the implication is yes, that should happen. So that's what Heckscher-Ohlin and Ripchinsky will tell you. If India gets more FDI, those sectors will expand at the expense of the other sectors. Okay? And the unemployment issue, look, I have to think a lot more about that. You're right that this model assumes full employment. Okay? So whether the effects of it is true that everything will change if you add rigidities, right? So if you add in things like unemployment and so, for instance, there is a big literature in development economics that looks at this idea of the informal sector and that it is not easy to transition. So there's the informal sector where people are sitting trying to get a job in the formal sector, and there's rigidity in the labor market due to that. Those types of things will change the results here. So this assumes absolutely no rigidities in the labor market. So it is full employment and seamless transition. Right now, how exactly will unemployment change the results? I have to think more about that, actually. So I will have to think about it and get back to you. I'm not sure if I can say that Ripchinsky will not hold in that setting. Okay? Because it is still going to set off that effect where the sector that uses labor intensively, even with unemployment, if there's immigration and you see an increase, it's a good question. Let me just say that I'll think about it and get back to you. Okay, so I'm going to note that down. Gautam, is there anything else I have to address at this point? I'll get back to unemployment once I've thought about it.
Let me go through once again. No, I think that's about it. I think people are just talking about that now.
Okay, sure.
One other question is comment is that these things are long run, but that's it.
Yes, that is true. These are definitely long run issues, right? So again, I don't have time for this, but in the short run, we have what is called as a specific factors trade model. It's called the Ricardo-Wiener model that talks about what happens in the short run. And there you're going to see that Ripchinsky will not hold, okay? Because you will see impacts on the wage because all the other factors of production are stuck. So capital is stuck And so because capital cannot move, you will see impacts on the wage. Okay? So yes, this is very much a medium to long run scenario. That is true. Any other
And
questions?
there's one about Martin et al. 2017 paper where would that address the question about FDI. I'm not familiar with this paper, but let me know if you.
Yeah, I actually don't know that paper, Martin et al. 2017. But I can look that up. If someone sends me the reference, then oh, I see the small scale reservation. You mean the dereservation of informal sector? I see. So
Yeah, that's
right. Yeah, that one. I don't know if it will address the. Yeah, they do have some FDI stuff in there as well, I think, but I don't know if they look at whether what happens to the wage and rental rates and so on, because this is about the impact of FDI on wages and rental rates, right? Outputs of the different sectors. I don't know. I'll have to look into it. I haven't. I don't remember exactly what they did and what they found.
And another one asked for some references on intertemporal trade models, I think dynamic models. I think that's a vast literature. Do you want to see anything?
That is a very vast literature. I think, Gautam, you are better suited. I am not familiar with a lot of the intertemporal
Yeah,
trade
again, I
models.
think it depends on the question. I'm not sure which, we can talk about that later.
Yeah, because you're right. A lot of all the models that I'm doing are not dynamic models. They're all static.
Right.
Yeah.
You can write to us and we can discuss this later.
Anything else before we move on?
No,
Okay, so what I'm going to do is now move on to increasing returns to scale. So we are now shifting. So we're shifting from the neoclassical world to new trade theory. Okay? So I'll motivate this by telling you a story. So what happens with the neoclassical models is people were talking about the Ricardian and Heckscher-Ohlin models, right? So these are the trade theorists. Now, people who were looking at the empirical side of things, so those who were looking at trade flows, were not paying any attention to the theory because they had what is called the gravity model of trade, right, which we will talk about tomorrow. And what the gravity model is it's a great way to capture trade flows between countries. It performs really well in the data, right? You can predict international trade really well with the gravity model. It has absolutely no foundation in economics. It comes from physics, right? And so the empirical trade economists were just using the physics-based gravity model to predict trade flows. So now what happens with the theorists where they told the empirical economists, how can you use this gravity model? It has basis in economic theory. And the empirical economists were like, well, we don't care because your theory doesn't really explain trade flows as well as the gravity model. So then comes, that's one thing. The second thing is, in the meantime, people also started observing that a lot of trade, international trade in modern times, is actually intra-industry trade. So it happens within an industry, and it is mostly between countries that are rich. Okay? And that's not really consistent with Heckscher-Ohlin and the Ricardian model. Why is it not consistent? Because both Heckscher-Ohlin and the Ricardian model will tell you that countries trade because they're different. Right? And if countries trade because they're different, then a lot of trade should happen between developed and developing countries because these are different, right? But that was not what happened in reality. In reality, what happened was it was similarly advanced countries that were trading a lot with each other. So intra-industry trade, more trade between OECD countries relative to between OECD and developing countries, combined with the fact that there wasn't really a firm foundation for the empirical gravity model, all of this prompted a lot of research and theory. And then comes Krugman with some answers to all of these discrepancies, right? So the Krugman model is the beginning really in the 1970s of what we call new trade theory. And then based on Krugman, I'm going to show you the Mellott's model, which we call as a part of new trade theory, which is sort of building on this Krugman monopolistic competition model. right? So what we're going to do is relax a whole bunch of assumptions now. So we're going to say, let's forget constant returns to scale and let's talk about increasing returns to scale. Okay? So here we have Krugman's new trade theory. We're leaving the new classical models behind. They're still very relevant. They're extremely relevant, but now a significant chunk of the trade literature is also devoted to new trade theory. What are the key insights of Krugman's model? First, we're going to talk about what happens when there's imperfect competition. So these models are all monopolistically competitive models, right? So it's not perfect competition anymore. Consumers have a love of variety. So what we assume is that there's product differentiation within sectors. Consumers like the variety that they get. And so this kind of product differentiation is going to drive international trade. And this model is going to be able to predict intra-industry trade. The important thing with the Krugman model is now there will be gains from trade from multiple sources. So earlier we talked about how we tracked what happened to the real wage, to purchasing power, how consumers can access a higher indifference curve, and so on. But now with Krugman, we're going to see that gains from trade are going to come from different sources. One is consumers gain from trade because they have access to more product varieties. And the second is there's going to be a pro-competitive effect. All right, so let's get into the IRS, increasing returns to scale Krugman model. This is the beginning of new trade theory. So monopolistic competition plus love of variety. So you're going to have to switch in your head a little bit now, because instead of talking about machinery and textiles, let's start talking about one sector and let's start looking within the sector. So we're going to say, let's take a sector like cars. And let's talk about variety of cars. So from now on, when I say a product variety, what I mean is one type of car. So a Toyota would be a variety, a BMW would be a variety, Mercedes would be a variety, but we're all still within the same sector, which is cars, right? So let's say we have N product varieties. We have L consumers. So we're talking about one economy here that has a labor endowment of L consumers. And the labor income, which is wage rate, is going to be W here. So let's first talk about the demand side, and then we'll talk about the supply side. We'll put the two together, and that will give us our equilibrium. And then we can talk about the trading equilibrium. So we're starting with autarky, defining the autarky equilibrium, then we'll open it up to international trade, right? So first, consumers face a utility function. So the utility function is simply that consumers get utility from consuming the N different varieties of these cars. And CI is going to be the consumption of a particular variety of cars. So CI would be, let's say, consumption of BMWs, right? Now, consumers are going to choose CI, which is consumption of a variety, to maximize their utility given by that utility function U, subject to the budget constraint. So the budget constraint is that you have income, which is your wage, and you're going to spend that on consuming this range of different products, right? CI. And the price is PI for each product variety. Now we're going to get a set of first order conditions. We will set up the utility maximization problem with a constraint, right? So we set up the Lagrangian, and we're going to get the set of FOCs, which is going to be that V prime. So the derivative of this V function with respect to C is V prime, and that equals lambda times PI. So this is the FOC from the first order, so from the utility maximization problem. Now, lambda is your usual Lagrange multiplier. It's the marginal utility of income, right? So this is a standard utility max. Now, we're going to define the demand elasticity. So what is the elasticity of demand for variety I? It's given by epsilon I, and it's defined in the standard way. Okay. Now, we can calculate dCi over dPi. And to do that, we're just going to totally differentiate the first order conditions on the previous slide, okay, again, to obtain the following. So V double prime dCi equals dPi times lambda. I'm just simply differentiating the previous condition one more time. And that gives me dci over dpi, which is just lambda over vw prime, v double prime, sorry. And by assumption, v double prime is going to be less than 0. Okay, so because this is the rate, this is the change in marginal utility less than 0. Now I define the elasticity of demand in the following way. And so I can say that elasticity of demand is negative v prime over ci, v double prime greater than 0. Okay. Now what we're going to assume is that as consumption falls, elasticity of demand goes up. So that's an assumption that we're going to make. And this happens when you have a linear demand curve or any other less convex curve than the constant elasticity. So think linear demand curve. In a standard linear demand curve, this property is going to hold that when consumption falls, the elasticity of demand goes up. Okay, so that was the demand side. Now let's look at what happens on the supply side. So labor is the only factor of production to keep life simple. Here's the production function. So in order to produce yi amount of variety I, I'm going to have to use Li equals alpha plus beta yi amount of labor. So that's your production function. I can now define the average cost of producing variety I, and that is simply the total cost. It's just labor cost, right? So W times the amount of labor I use, that's my total cost. Divided by yi, which is the output. Now, substituting for Li from the production function, I can write the average cost as W alpha over yi plus W beta. Okay. Now, if you look at that equation, you see that the marginal cost here is just W times beta, right? And then there's also going to be a fixed cost component, of course. So W beta gives you the marginal cost of production. Now the equilibrium is producer and consumer. So we're going to put all of this together to get the equilibrium. And we will solve for, as usual, prices and quantities. But because this is a monopolistic competition model, we will also solve for the total number of firms or varieties in this case in equilibrium. Okay? So N is going to be the total number of varieties or the number of firms. I'm going to use firm and variety interchangeably here. All right, so let's do that. So producer equilibrium, profit maximization means marginal revenue equals marginal cost. The zero profit condition means price equals average cost. Now we're going to drop this I because with the Krugman model, there isn't really any difference between the varieties, right? They all have the same production structure. So we're going to drop I for simplicity. MR equals MC means I can write that as marginal revenue here expressed in terms of the elasticity of demand equals the marginal cost from the previous slide. Or in other words, P over W is beta times epsilon divided by epsilon minus 1, where epsilon is the elasticity of demand. Now we're going to call this relationship the PP curve. Okay. We're going to use the price equals average cost condition to derive another curve that's called the ZZ curve. So price equals average cost means P equals this expression right here, which is the average cost that we derived on the previous slide. And I can write that as P over W equals alpha over LC plus beta. Now what I have is two different curves. Both of them are giving you the relationship between P over W. So think of P over W as the inverse of the real wage, right? So W over P is the real wage. P over W is the opposite of that. Right? It's prices relative to the wage. And I can graph that against consumption of each variety or quantity of each variety. So that's what we're going to do here. The ZZ curve is going to be downward sloping. Right? And what is the intuition for why the ZZ curve is downward sloping? As consumption increases, as C increases, the output per firm is going up, which means because this is an increasing returns to scale model, remember that there's a fixed cost component, right, in the production structure. That means it's an IRS model by definition. Firms are going to be able to exploit these economies of scale and your average costs are going to fall. So if firms expand, given that there is fixed costs and increasing returns to scale, your average costs are going to fall as your output goes up. And that means that the equilibrium price is going to fall. So that's just an efficiency gain, right? So that's the ZZ curve, which is downward sloping. On the other hand, what the PP curve tells us is it comes from the demand side. It tells us that as consumption goes up, by assumption, the elasticity of demand is going to fall. If the elasticity of demand falls, right, demand becomes relatively inelastic, then the price is going to increase, because note that this is in perfect competition setting. So there's going to be markups, right? So if the elasticity of demand falls, price goes up. So that's your PP curve. Now we put both of these together and derive the equilibrium prices relative to wage in the economy, and the C naught, which is the consumption of each variety of the product. Okay, then once we do that, we have prices and quantity. We now have to solve for the number of firms. So what is the relationship between consumption, C, per variety, and the number of varieties or firms, N? So to do that, let's use the labor market equilibrium condition and the fact that total production has to equal consumption. So production is given by Xi. So this is how much firms are producing of each variety. Ci is the consumption of each variety, and in equilibrium, L is the labor force. So total consumption of each variety by everyone in the population has to equal the total production of that variety. Labor demand equals labor supply. Again, we are assuming full employment. All of these models use full employment as an assumption. And we are going to assume symmetry. As I said, all the I's look the same. The firms all look the same. So then what we know is labor demand. Labor supply here is given by L. Labor demand is just the sum over all the firms in the economy over how much each firm demands, which is Li. And so I can substitute in for Li from the production function, and then that gives me N times alpha plus beta X, where X is production. Okay. So then I can write N as a function of L here in the numerator and alpha plus beta X in the denominator. But I know that X is simply L times C from condition A, right? Total production equals consumption. So substituting for X, I have my final expression for the number of firms in equilibrium, which is 1 over alpha over L plus beta times C. So let's look at these things a little bit. Let's look at the intuition here. So the equilibrium value of C determines the number of products N. So C is a determinant of the number of products. What happens when C goes up? In other words, the consumption of a variety goes up. So since C is in the denominator, if it goes up, then the number of varieties in equilibrium goes down. So higher consumption of a particular variety is related to a lower number of varieties in equilibrium. What happens if L goes up? What happens if your population size or the size of the economy goes up? Then alpha over L is going to go down, which means N is going to increase. In other words, a larger economy, right, can sustain a larger number of varieties. And this is obvious if you have traveled, right? If you go to large countries like the US, China, even India for that matter, you're going to see a much wider variety of products. So more varieties are sustained in equilibrium. Okay, so that was the autarky model. What we did was we looked at how equilibrium prices and consumption quantity is set, and we look at how the number of firms is determined. Now, this is all quite standard to any monopolistic competition model. So the interesting part is going to come now when we say what happens when you open up to international trade. Right? So how does Krugman think about the impact of trade? What we're going to do is we are just going to say that let's take two economies that look exactly alike, okay, and we just merge them together. So these are just exactly the two same economies. We're merging them together. So if you think about your neoclassical models, which is Heckscher-Ohlin and the Ricardian model, there's absolutely no reason to trade. Because note that these are identical economies. They have the same size, they have the same technology, they have the same tastes, right? Consumers are the same. So there shouldn't be a reason to trade in a conventional trade model, in a neoclassical model. But in this model, we are going to get international trade when two of these countries merge. Why is that? And that's because firms are producing differentiated products, right? So the varieties produced in one country are going to be different from the varieties produced in the other country. And because consumers really like variety, they are going to demand varieties from the other country. Okay, so India has cars, Germany also has cars. But why do Indians demand German cars? Right? Because German varieties are different from Indian varieties. And consumers like varieties, so they are going to demand varieties from Germany, and that's going to give rise to Indians exporting cars to Germany, but Germans also exporting cars to the US, to India, right? That's not going to happen in Heckscher-Ohlin. It's not going to happen in the Ricardian model. Now, next, because of this increasing returns to scale, what is also going to happen is that competition is going to be reducing prices. So you're going to see a pro-competitive effect of trade. With international trade, as two economies merge, competition is going to drive down prices. So you're going to get gains at two levels. One, more varieties for the consumer. B, lower prices for the consumer. So trade is really good for two reasons in this model. So let's talk about how this happens. Now, when the only thing I'm changing with international trade is we're increasing L, we're doubling L. L becomes 2 times L, right? So if L becomes 2 times L, nothing happens to the PP condition, because if you remember the PP condition from the previous slide, L doesn't really factor the PP condition. So it's not going to change the PP, but it does change the Z condition, because note that L is in the denominator in the Z condition. So if you increase L to 2L, or that's the same as saying I am decreasing C to half of C, right? So 2L is the same thing as saying half C. And so that is going to change the ZZ curve, and it's going to shift the Z curve to Z star, because if L goes up in the denominator, you're going to see a leftward shift. What happens to the new equilibrium under international trade? Well, let's look at what happened here. C naught went down to C1 in the new equilibrium. P over W naught went down to P over W1. So already you are seeing a big gain from trade, right? So for consumers, the prices have gone down from P over W naught to P over W1. Okay. So the first effect of trade, L doubles, there is a gain in the real wage. In other words, the prices go down. Consumption of each variety goes down here. So C naught goes to C1. We know what happens, right? We have discussed this. When the consumption of each variety goes down, the number of varieties in equilibrium is going to go up, right? So that's your other gain from trade. So let's take one at a time. Free trade doubles L. The N in each country is going to fall with trade. Why does that happen? Because even though the total number of varieties goes up, you have your Indian varieties and you have the German varieties. So the consumer can now access a lot more varieties in the trade equilibrium. But note that firms are going to be expanding their production, right? So your X is going to actually go up. Each firm is producing more, which means it is more competitive because average cost is lower when you are producing more. So average cost is going down. That means prices have also gone down in equilibrium. Okay? So firms are further along their average cost curves. Output per firm is higher. So what are we saying ultimately? We're saying that with international trade, each firm is producing a lot more. But if each firm is producing a lot more, given that your resources are fixed and labor cannot move between countries, what we're saying is some firms are expanding, right? And that can only happen if some firms exit, because you just have the same L. Okay. So given full employment, some firms need to have exited the market. In other words, the number of varieties in each country is going to go down. Okay, so let's be very, very clear about this. With international trade, India and Germany put together have more varieties, because not only are you getting the Indian varieties, you're also getting the German varieties. However, because the Indian firms are now bigger than before, they are exploiting their scale economies, they have larger output that they're producing, they are going down their average cost curves, that means that there are now fewer Indian firms and fewer German firms than before. In other words, with international trade, you have had exit of a few firms. Okay. So you can see here what happens to the number of varieties, right? We know that n equals 1 over alpha over L plus beta times C. So n rises because, of course, L has increased, and we saw from the equilibrium that C has fallen. Both of this means that n has gone up. Right? So let's summarize the impacts here. Economies of scale effect. The number of varieties produced in each country necessarily falls. That means each firm is producing more of the same variety. And so there's an economies of scale gain. There's a pro-competitive effect. Opening up to trade means that your prices have gone down. P over W has fallen. The real wage has gone up. Markups have been reduced due to the competition. Now, one quick note, and this is a nuance that you may or may not be interested in. We can't really say anything about the direction of trade in this model. So we don't really talk about who is exporting what, right? We just know that all consumers demand all varieties of products. So it's really less relevant to talk about what country is exporting what and so on in the Krugman model. Okay. So any questions on Krugman? Because Krugman is really the fundamental for new trade theory. Once you understand Krugman, then all of these other models like Mellott's are going to build on the Krugman model. Okay. So
yeah, I think one question maybe you already answered. What determines different varieties produced in different countries in the model? That was the last thing.
Yeah, that was the last point. Yep.
And the other one is, okay, so since we are assuming that countries are symmetric in every way, what, I mean, why does variety increase? I mean, he's, I think, assuming that varieties are also the same across countries.
No, so varieties are different. So this is a model of differentiation, right? So the idea is something like red toothpaste and white toothpaste. They're not the same, right? They are different varieties. So if India is only making white toothpaste, then you want the German red toothpaste, for example. So that is the idea that the varieties are slightly different, right? And consumers like variety. It's a love of variety utility function, which means that I prefer to have white and red toothpaste. I like that. It gives me strictly more utility. Okay.
The other one is north-south as opposed to symmetric countries. What does that happen? What happens? So I think even in the example that you considered where L goes up,
yeah,
it was L going up in both countries or all countries. So if one L goes up and not the other, what happens? I guess.
Oh, so right. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, you can address that. I'll read the other question.
So basically what happens, so we're talking more about two L's merging together, right? So we're saying, and the reason we do that is we're saying, look, these are two identical countries and we're just merging them together. So technically there should be no reason to trade. So we're eliminating all reasons to trade. And all we are saying is, even though you have countries that are totally the same, as long as you have this differentiation idea, there is going to be a need for trade. Okay, so that is why we don't really, you can have a country that's smaller, right? You can have a large country and a small country coming together. So in that sense, the increase in L is not going to be 2L. It might be 1.5, for example. That's all that would change. But the reason we're doing it this way is we want to see, even though these are identical countries, with no real neoclassical reason to trade, once you have this love of variety and monopolistic competition, you're going to get these trade effects. Okay.
So Krugman model, is it similar to core periphery models or north-south? I think part of that you've already answered. Are firm profits affected after trade opens up? That's another question. And what is saying that both the countries will not produce the same white toothpaste? I think with this complete specialization in one type of variety as opposed to, yeah.
So the profits one, so these are monopolistic competition models, right? So you're always going to have zero profits in equilibrium. So once the long run equilibrium is reached, all firms are making zero profits in these models. So there's really no difference between autarky and trade in that sense, right? And in terms of the varieties, I didn't understand. So, I mean, the inherent assumption is that the varieties are different, right? So even within countries, different firms are producing different varieties, right? So by extension, if you have more firms in the other country, they're all producing different varieties. Okay? So that's how these love of variety models work.
I think one way to think about that would be, the productivities are different in producing different types of varieties. So you may have, you have a minimum price that is available to you, and you just choose that price.
Okay, I don't want to go into the productivity story because of what we're going to do next, which is exactly that, right? Which is the Mellott's, where you allow for these productivity differences driving a lot, right? So I want to say productivity is a different thing. So with the Krugman, it's almost like saying, look, everything is the same. All that is different is some firms are making black and some firms are making red, and consumers like that variety. That's all it's trying to say. Okay, so we don't want to get into the productivity differentials, which we will with the next model. In fact, that's the whole point of the Mellott's model.
Sure. Yes.
Okay. Anyone else? Anything else pressing?
No, I think.
Okay, so how are we doing on time? We are running. We're coming up to the end, right?
Yes, we have maybe 5-10 minutes today.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is the Mellott's model is actually a bit heavier than the Krugman model. So it's not a good idea to do it when everyone is tired right now. So I probably should do it when everyone is fresh tomorrow. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tell you the story of the Mellott's model, and then I'll break so that when you come back, you've had some time to think about it and kind of distill it a little bit. Okay, I think that would be a good plan. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds
okay.
Good.
All right, so let me talk a little bit again. I want to reiterate. So I want to tell this like a story, right? Otherwise, people get overwhelmed with all the different models. So that's why I always like to go back to the evolution of trade theory. So we started out with the neoclassical models, HO and the Ricardian. Note that all of these models don't really talk about firms, right? So when we talked about HO and Ricardian, we kept saying textiles, apparel, computers. We took that as a sector. We didn't really talk about what happens within textiles or within machinery. So we're treating firms as black boxes in these neoclassical models. They all have constant returns to scale. So none of the whole efficiencies, economies of scale, some of those things we are tackling. For instance, we have imperfect competition. We're talking about markups. We're talking about pro-competitive effects. Right? We're talking about firm sizes. We're talking about what output a particular firm would produce. And we're also talking about firms producing a particular variety and then exporting that to everywhere else in the world. Okay. So let me now go back to the data. Let us appeal to the data a little bit. Now, what happened in the early 2000s was that after Krugman, and the fact we will talk about this tomorrow, Krugman's model is also a very nice foundation for the gravity model of trade, right? Because what the Krugman model tells us is countries that are large are going to have more varieties. And if you have more varieties, then you're going to trade a lot more. So two large countries are going to end up trading more than, say, two small countries, simply because of the variety effect, right? So, and that is exactly the foundation of the gravity model, because the gravity model tells you that trade is proportional, directly proportional to the economic mass of two countries that are trading. So two countries with high GDP will trade more with each other. That's the idea of gravity. And the Krugman model is a good foundation for that. So with the Krugman model, people were happy that there's a theoretical foundation for gravity. People were seminal work by Bernard, Eaton, Jensen, and Kortum. We call this BJEK in 2003. And there are several other studies that came up contemporaneously which had a lot of detailed firm level data. Okay, and they said, well, let's look at firms, because firms are the ones that are exporting. Industries don't export, right? Firms export. So let's actually look at the data to see what the data is telling us. They basically observed all these stylized facts. First thing, not all firms export. So even though I say India has a competitive advantage in textiles, so India is going to export textiles, not all Indian firms are exporting textiles. Even within textiles, it's only a very few that export, right? Exporters are not exporting everything they produce. So even exporters actually sell most of their product in the domestic market. And what we find is the more productive exporters are, the more they service the more advanced market. So if you look at Indian firms and look at textiles, you'll find that the more productive Indian firms will be exporting to the US and Germany and so on, right? The other question here for the empirically minded, it's a very interesting question, is when you look at productive firms exporting, what do you make of it? Do you say that more productive firms end up exporting, or do you say that exporting actually increases the productivity of firms? So this is a chicken and egg story. Is it productive firms exporting, or that exporting increases productivity, right? The other thing is we find that exporting firms are just much larger than non-exporting firms. So micro level data indicates that trade liberalization really leads to substantial reallocation across firms. So what people observed is once you liberalize trade, you see that a lot of the less productive firms just exit the market, and the more productive firms actually grow much larger. So that there is this reallocation that people observed in the data. And so here I have some data from the BEJK 2003 AER paper, where they're looking at plant level productivity. And they're looking unconditional. So they're looking at the standard deviation of productivity across firms. So how variable is productivity? And what they see is even when you look within 4-digit industries, when you look within capital intensity bins, so you're looking at firms that have very similar levels of capital intensity, very similar production labor shares, right? So if you look at firms that are very similar in a lot of other ways, you will still see that there's quite a lot of variation in their productivity levels, even within these bins. And what you will also see is there is a massive productivity advantage of exporters, even when you look within these small, well-defined bins, right? And this is, of course, for the US, but this study has been replicated for a lot of other countries. The findings don't really change. There's huge heterogeneity when it comes to productivity across firms. Right? Look at and this is the US, mind you. So for US firms, let's look at US manufacturing firms that are exporting. This is as of 2002. Exporting is extremely rare. Okay? Look at the percentage of firms that are exporting in the United States, and this is across various sectors. So even let's look at the sectors where the US has a competitive advantage, say transport equipment, machinery, computer manufacturing, and so on. You see that it's under less than 10%. Firms are actually exporting, right? Sorry, so this is I should. Firms exporting in the chemicals manufacturing sector. So the point they're making is, look, exporting is not as common as we think. It is actually extremely rare. Right? And if you look at exports as a percentage of total shipments, even exporters are not exporting everything. They're exporting a small share of their shipments. All right, so I have already talked to you about the empirics of the chicken and egg story. Is it that more productive firms export, or does exporting lead to productivity? Those of you who want to write any AER papers, here's your chance. If you can fix this the endogeneity issue here, which is giving what, right? Then you have some opportunities here for an AER paper. I must say though that in the last few years there's been a lot of randomized control trials. I don't know if you know what those are. They're called RCTs, where you basically randomly allocate export opportunities to firms, and then you see whether they improve their productivity. So that's actually a good way of tackling this endogeneity, but it's extremely expensive. Not everyone can do an RCT. Okay. Okay, so let me take you to the theory. I'll set it up and then we will close. So we need a theory that incorporates all of this. We need a theory that incorporates within sector heterogeneity, that gives us the result that more productive firms export. And that's what the Mellott's model is going to do. It's going to introduce a fixed cost of exporting. It's going to introduce the idea that firms are very different when it comes to productivity levels. And it is going to combine this firm heterogeneity and productivity given with the fixed cost of exporting. And that's actually going to generate a lot of the results that we saw in the data. So this is a story where the data is driving the theory, right? So people observe things in the data, and then the theory actually tries to explain some of those results. So I think I will stop there, because the next thing we're going to do is talk about the Mellott's model. I won't have time to do the extensions, but I will tell you about the extensions and you can look them up. So tomorrow we will start with the Mellott's model. Okay? So I will close there. Thank you very much, and I hope to see all of you tomorrow.
Thanks, everyone. Asha, just share with me the lecture slides for tomorrow, so
Yes.
that when we begin tomorrow, I'll share the link with everyone.
Yes. Now, one thing I do want to note is that I'm going to be doing some Stata work. So I can't, those slides, that's not really a slide. I will be doing it on the screen. So people are going to have to follow me on the screen as I run things in Stata, if that's okay.
Yeah. And another thing is, there's a question saying, in light of today's lecture, can you spend some time on Ballas-Samuelson effect?
Okay. So I will do that. And also I'll talk a bit about unemployment. I know I promised I will think about that. So I'll do that tomorrow.
Sure. Yeah. Logs file from Stata, apparently people think that would be a good idea.
Okay.
And the data for tomorrow's class.
So I can't share the data with you because some of it is, so the firm data for at least is confidential. So I cannot share that, but I can share the gravity data. We will run into size issues though. So Gautam, we'll have to talk about it. I don't know what's the best way to share.
Right, I'll figure that part out.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks everyone. Thank you.
And I think the best way is to put it in Dropbox and share, so that I can share the link here, like I'm doing with the lecture slides.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
So what I'll do tomorrow is I'll start with gravity, and then we will see how we go on time, right? Because I think I definitely want to do gravity. If I have time, I will tackle a little bit of the productivity estimation.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay. Thank you.
And
Thanks. Bye, everyone.